plan upon which we're all meeting today. We may be referring to technical devices for further information, and also to note that the meeting has been recorded and live streamed. I have an apology from Councillor Hill from the City of Joondalup, and it's noted that Councillor Hill was also on leave of absence. Minutes from previous meetings are available on the DAP website. Move to Part B, the City of Joondalup item. Can I get a confirmation that all panel members have duly considered the documentation before you? Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you. Are there any disclosures of interest?
No.
No. Thank you. We have application item 3.1, which is the residential building in Camberwara Drive in Craigie. Presentation from, first of all, Mr. Dan Pearce.
Good morning, members. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. Speaking on behalf of the Whitfords Catholic Primary School, we made a submission on the item. Just to jump straight into it, I think the key position that we articulated in our submission was our view that at the moment the application is premature in its current form. Our view is that in the absence of a potential tenant being identified for the site, that essentially, and that enabling more information to be provided about what's proposed and the relevant conditions that would be imposed on an approval to manage and mitigate impacts, that the application should probably be deferred or refused until such time as that information is provided. By way of background, you'd be aware that the site obviously has a quite sensitive history, and on behalf of our client, there was sort of an expectation that determination of future use for the site would probably adopt a more precautionary principle and employ all reasonable efforts to mitigate approval. And on the basis of the recommendation for approval today, we're not convinced that that approach has been taken. In essence, there's three main points that we would like to make. Firstly, that it's premature. Secondly, that in our view, as it's currently put together, it doesn't meet the objectives for the private community purposes zone, which is necessary for the JDAP to exercise the required discretion. And that thirdly and relatedly, that operational management plan that is being proposed to manage future impacts is not an appropriate mechanism to do so. Very quickly, with respect to the zone objectives, there are three, and in our view, the application meets none of those. Firstly, that it's necessary to provide sites for privately owned and operated recreation institutions and places of worship. Firstly, we're not convinced that a residential building satisfies any of those use classes. Secondly, that the uses would be incidental and ancillary to such facilities on the site. Evidently, a residential building is comprises the whole of the site and therefore doesn't satisfy that. And then thirdly, that the standard development is keeping with surrounding development and protects the amenity of the area. And again, in the absence of specific information around what uses are going to occur on the site, other than it just being residential, that we don't feel there's enough information to make that determination as to whether it's either compatible or as to whether it will, in fact, protect the amenity of the area. We think it'd be better that if that information were provided or that the land were rezoned to facilitate the use that's being proposed is probably a more appropriate pathway. And finally, with respect to the operational management plan, our submission sets that out in some detail. We don't feel essentially that it's appropriate that that is the mechanism used to condition the application. We think that if sufficient information is provided, that conditions can be set as part of the development approval rather than to defer those aspects to an operational management plan. We've set out that we don't believe it satisfies some of the principles for the drafting and planning conditions. I'll touch on them very briefly. Firstly, that the approval needs to be final and can't defer important aspects, which in this case is the management of potential impacts associated with the proposal, which we believe that the operational management plan is being utilised to get around the fact that there's not enough information for the JDAP to impose relevant conditions. Secondly, that whilst you can use management plans, evidently, that they need to be incidental or ancillary to the development that's being proposed, whereas in this case, questions of traffic and parking, noise, visual privacy, hours of operation, all of those matters are matters to be dealt with in the operational management plan. They should in fact be conditions of approval in our view. And thirdly, the question of supervision by the local government. I note that the city has said that it's satisfied and quite comfortable with using that mechanism retrospectively to apply conditions of approval and to manage it, although I think it's quite an unusual mechanism to utilise, and in particular for a site with a recently contested history to defer all of those aspects downstream to essentially what is a private treaty between the applicant and the city. Not sure that that seems entirely appropriate. Again, all of these matters would be able to be circumvented, I presume, if an application that sets out, in fact, all the matters that are intended to be done on the site are put before the public and are able to be appropriately conditioned. And on that basis, we submit that it should probably be deferred or refused until that information is presented.
Thank you, Mr. Pearce. Questions of the presenter from panel members?
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll move to Mr. Cake and Mr. Graham.
Right, good morning, panel members. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I'm obviously here to speak in support of the residential building at 252 to 254 Canberra Drive in Craigie. Firstly, we just want to express our support for the recommendation of approval that's been provided by the City of Joondalup and stress that this application is primarily a change of use only. And despite some of the contentions raised by Mr. Pearce, the assessment and determination of change of use applications don't require a confirmed tenant or business. Who the tenant is or might be is not a relevant planning consideration under clause 67, sorry, the deemed provisions. And we've been involved in numerous development applications that get granted approval for a warehouse, a shop, a medical centre where the actual tenant itself is not known. That is a pretty commonly accepted planning principle. Jumping straight into the conditions of approval that we would look at deleting. The first is condition 5 related to the amalgamation. The buildings themselves are existing. There's no BCA requirement or anything that requires an amalgamation of the two lots that exist at the site currently. And our concern is requiring this condition is going to delay the occupancy of the development and delay the delivery of important housing to the community. Condition 6, dealing with the landscaping. This is inherently linked to the parking condition as well. If the parking or if the panel decides that the additional parking is not required, then I would imagine that the condition requiring the landscaping plan should fall away. Reason for that is landscaping at the site won't be modified. It's existing, it's well maintained, and AGM will do that as the owner of the site moving forward as well. Now, condition 7 related to the construction of the additional parking bays that were identified through the operational management plan. Our request and preference is that the construction of these bays be deferred or only be required should a specific tenant actually require that parking. The facility itself has operated for many number of years with the parking that's existing on site already. And there's been measures that have been put in place through the operational management plan that ensures the number of vehicles on site need to match the number of parking. There's provisions that don't require residents or don't allow residents to have car bays. There's measures that encourage shared transport, use of bikes, use of public transport, all that sort of stuff. And our view is that the combination of those measures and the restrictions through the operational management plan will ensure that there's no parking from residents that is going to spill over or end up in other residential streets surrounding the development. Acknowledging the fact that the tenant is unknown and potentially a conservative view could be taken with regard to providing the maximum number of parking provided, regardless of whether or not it's going to be required. Our preference is, and acknowledgement is, if we select or if AGM select a tenant that does have those additional parking demands, the intent or preference would be to amend the DA at that point in time to seek approval for the construction of those additional car parking bays. The alternative is obviously those bays get constructed now as part of this DA and then just go unused, and we've removed landscaping for no real purpose or benefit. Before wrapping up and handing over Ben, just to touch on some of the, I guess, the leasing EOI processes that have occurred to date around potentially selecting a tenant. Just want to briefly touch on the appropriateness of an operational management plan. Again, we feel this is a pretty commonly accepted planning condition, and have actually recently been involved in a residential building DA in the City of Canning where that was resolved to approve an operational management plan as a condition of approval. We had another one in the City of Wanneroo very recently with the same client, Uniting WA. The panel resolved not to require an operational management plan for that one. We had another one at the Aluka Tavern in Joondalup that AGM were involved in as well that had an operational management plan as a condition of approval. But it's quite a common mechanism to control the operational aspects of a use because you are approving a use and not a business. So we don't see any issues with that condition of planning approval, and in fact welcome it from the City of Joondalup. Just hand over to Ben to briefly touch on some of the leasing processes that have occurred to date and give a bit more background and maybe around the potential tenants that have expressed an interest in the site, just to give the panel a bit more background.
Yeah, okay. Thanks panel members. I'd preface by up front, I'm not a technical planner by any means, so I will leave the expertise and the technical discussion to those far more knowledgeable than I. But I will say that just from a planning perspective, it's been great, and I really appreciate the school, the work we've done with the school to date. And we've met with them several times even prior to contracting, and the City of Joondalup. And whilst we don't necessarily agree on all specific conditions, I think it's been quite a robust and good process that I've been through, again, from a non-planning perspective. So thanks first and foremost for their time and involvement today. Yeah, from an operational management plan point of view and from the residential building perspective, we had earlier discussions with the City of Joondalup to try to confirm what would be the best use for the site in terms of the typologies that we're proposing to do. And we wanted to be really clear during the community consultation process of the types of, which is reflected in the DA, of the types of typologies that could be potentially accommodated within a residential building, and make it really clear what wouldn't as well. So picking up on Mr. Pearce's comments, which I think are important, although I don't necessarily I think that the previous use should guide, and what was proposed by the previous proponent should guide or impact what we're proposing to do. We certainly took on board the local sensitivities. I live relatively close in the surrounding suburbs and well aware of the sensitivities. And for that reason, we're really clear that with the residential building, to give that some definition as to what that might look like, we talked to the community and through the DA process about the different typologies and what that might look like in terms of from an operational perspective and the types of people that might be eventually accommodated there. We've had good interest to date from a real range of uses, from skilled workforce accommodation to student type accommodation. We've run an EOI process and really tried to cast the net as wide as we could in the face of a housing crisis to say we've got a great building that's been well constructed since the 1970s. It's ready to occupy minus some cosmetic work. How can we bring this to the market as quickly as possible and try to address this desperate need that the state and the nation's got from a housing perspective? And through that collaborative approach came up with the approach that I'm really comfortable with, which was to tell the community all the different types of uses that could be there, put in place a really detailed plan to talk about how it's going to be managed moving forward. And then hopefully that allows us to then talk with some certainty to tenants to bring them in as quickly as possible. And to, as I said, inject 32 odd rooms into the market to try and hopefully just ease that pressure that I know a lot of families are feeling out there and from a housing perspective at the moment. So.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Questions of the presenters from panel members? Yes, Brian.
I understand what you just said there. It's obvious from the material that's been presented and the city's assessment that applying for the change of use now, as opposed to waiting for an operator, has created a number of complexities in terms of trying to assess it appropriately, and also to provide enough certainty moving forward, not just for yourselves but for surrounding uses and occupiers and so on. Is there? Can you say a bit more about why you're not waiting for an operator? Because when that happens, then there will be more certainty. It will be easier to assess. The residents will know more, the occupiers around would know more about the context, and the conditions can be set clearly. So can you just say a bit more about why it is that you're not waiting on an operator?
Yeah, can I go first? Yeah. So from our perspective, in order to drive the discussion with groups, organisations, private not-for-profits, state government organisations and the public sector, the big thing at the moment in order to provide accommodation is certainty, and people can make organisations. What we've found to date, and this probably extends it right across the gamut, but especially for a site like this, having the certainty of a DA and an understanding of requirements built into the operation management plan and restrictions that we would be imposing on a tenant helps drive those commercial decisions to take a not-for-profit or a state government agency or a private sector organisation. It allows them certainty and commitment on timeframes in order for them to execute a lease. If we were to post-date and go through the DA process only once a tenant's been confirmed, and we know how long DAs can take, that would obviously impact the ability of a tenant to make a decision, because it would be subject to a DA and conditions that come post that. The ability to bring this to market now and provide certainty to an incoming tenant is really what's driving us and the desire to proceed in this way. Because with that certainty, we're far more confident that we can show a tenant how the site can operate, what the conditions are, and effectively allow them to move in with relative ease, knowing what the conditions are, rather than making a deal conditional upon a DA and then going through that process. And we think the rigour that we've applied, the exclusions that we've applied, so during the process, again, aware of the sensitivities that the community that they raised previously in regards to the prior operator, we specifically excluded drug rehab or similar style accommodation to be really clear that that's not a use that we would entertain. The same with backpackers accommodation, to again allay those fears that those types of uses would specifically not be available. And we gave the community the opportunity, through demonstrating and mentioning the different types of typologies, the opportunity to come to us during the DA process and say, these are all the types of potential uses, please provide your feedback, because we want it as wide as possible with the certainty to secure one of these tenants, get them in as quickly as possible. But here's all the types of things that we're thinking about, so please provide your comments accordingly. And I think from a non-planning perspective, the site previously, I think, attracted a petition of 300 to 400 people opposed, and our DA process, which I think was well advertised, I think, for a pretty extended period of time, and I certainly met with a lot of people during that time, members, and gave them as much feedback as I could. I think there was probably 20 odd submissions.
Yeah, 30, I think, maybe.
30 odd submissions. So to me, that probably demonstrated that the community has a level of acceptance with the approach that we've taken, being really transparent to the types of uses, because it gave them the opportunity to comment. So hopefully that makes sense as to why we've done it. And again, that certainty piece to be able to give to a tenant who need that before they can transact and enter into agreement is, and similar to a similar approach to what we've done previously as well, whether it be for a shop or a childcare, not having the actual operator on board.
Just add to that briefly, I think the change of use side of things and the site's history is probably where a lot of the concern and worry has come from. If this was a separate site that maybe wasn't interested by Shalom or didn't have the checkered history that it does, I don't think there would be the angst or the concern or the worry about an application which is pretty plain and simply just a change of use. The building has been used for residential accommodation in the past. It's not a dramatic change to what the site has been used for historically. It's really just formalising the land use approval and probably also adding an operational management plan to give confidence around how that site's going to operate.
Dan, do you accept that the operational management plan is trying to add elements that would normally be a condition of approval?
Yes, I think the operational management plan is probably an easier document to amend and is a bit more of a moving beast, I guess, that can chop and change depending on the tenant that ends up at the site. I think conditions of planning approval are very final, I guess, and the requirement to amend them requires a Form 2 process, and administratively it's much longer and more painful to say have operational management plan provisions as conditions of planning approval. Yeah, I guess it can just be amended more easily.
So do you accept then that one of the tenets of a good condition is it be certain and final,
Yes.
which then puts it at odds with it floating around in an operational management plan?
Yes, to some extent. I think the provisions in the operational management plan are certain and final. It's just amending that document is easier than amending a planning approval. So I think the condition requiring the operational management plan is certain because the provisions in that plan are certain. It's just amending that is an easier process than a condition of planning.
Okay, further questions? Yes.
Just following on from that, as is been inferred, the operational management plans try and do an awful lot. So for me, I'm looking at it, is it very clear exactly what it's going to do? And the concern I have is that you've submitted, well, firstly, your proposals seem to be at odds with the assessment of the officers. So I'm hearing you say, and in your submission, that it is not the intention of you and your client to provide extra parking. It's quite clear. You're just saying it could be provided should someone need it. The city has taken a different view, and through the conditions proposed are saying you must provide it. It sounds like what your intention is not to provide it.
I can jump. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, go on then.
Yeah. So the intention is to provide it if required, and that's in terms of if the tenant would seek to request additional bays than are currently there. We think I know the number of the tenants that we've spoken to all have a provision of shared accommodation, whether it's student accommodation and buses or skilled workers and buses to the site. And the site has operated with its current capacity with those additional bays since the 1970s in a similar style. So we're really confident that the number of bays there, both the public car park as well as the triple garage, et cetera, will accommodate the required bays, and that'll be necessitated through us obligating the tenant to accept the bays that are there. If they were to come to us and say we need additional bays, then we'd be happy to vary a condition, not the OMP, but we'd be happy to accept a condition that required X number of bays to be constructed, because we're confident based on the tenants, the number of bays provided will be sufficient. However, we did want to demonstrate that if there is a requirement to deliver more, we'd be happy to accept a condition to build those number of bays. My desire to not do the bays now is that the site, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the site, but it's about 35% site cover. It's a testament to the previous proponent prior to Immersive Care that establishes really nice gardens with grass and trees and native vegetation, which would be replaced by parking. If we can avoid removing that and only do it at the point in time in which there's a condition requiring us to me, that's a much, much better outcome. However, we're confident that the parameters of the OMP will guide specifically the types of tenants that we've identified. But if there is an additional requirement for parking, we'd be happy to accept a condition at that time to vary it, not vary the OMP.
Okay, so if I may, what you're asking is to remove conditions 5, 6, and 7, which pretty much just leaves the OMP to do everything.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
And from what I hear you say is that you've got no intention of providing that parking, even though the recommendation says you have to. I'm sorry, I haven't finished my sentences. So what that's suggesting to me is that that in effect, even if those conditions were left there, you're not going to do that. You're going to wait for a tenant and then argue you don't need it. I'm pointing here.
Yeah, so the condition requiring the operational management plan, it includes a provision that limits cars on site to match the number of bays provided. If a condition ended up on the approval that required us to construct the additional parking that I guess is identified on the plan and the locations that we've suggested that it could easily occur, there's no ability to I guess not do that except we're coming back through a Form 2 process or something along those lines like the city suggested, where we did have a tenant that demonstrated they didn't have that parking requirement essentially.
Which suggests that this approval won't be implemented as intended by the city.
It could very well likely be implemented as intended if the tenant had that parking demand.
You just said you still need a Form 2 and need to come back.
A tenant that requires those additional bays, because then that approval, I guess, is valid, because the parking and landscape is inherently linked. So if it's approved as is, we would, and if we found a tenant that had the parking demand for those additional bays, we would need to submit a landscaping plan, because landscaping is being removed. Presumably there'll be more trees and stuff in the actual additional parking area that we provide. The parking condition, I guess, is satisfied by virtue of the construction of those additional bays. The amalgamation is somewhat of a separate issue. I mean, it's a reasonably commonly accepted planning principle that buildings over boundaries, you do an amalgamation. Given it's not required from a BCA standpoint and a delay in potential occupancy, our preference is to have that removed. But if the DA was approved with it on, we would have no choice essentially to give the confidence.
Yeah.
But what it suggests that you're saying is there's insufficient information now to be able to make a clear determination that will ensure that both you've got a clear way forward, but also the city and the people that will be living in the area. It sounds like you don't have the information, and it appears evident that these conditions may or may not ever be of use, because you don't know who the tenant will be and what the, I mean, if I may, you talk about car parking.
Yeah.
I've read everything that's been presented, and I've seen 10 extra spaces, I've seen 9 extra spaces, and I've seen another reference to 5 extra spaces. So if you're going to argue that,
What's the question, Brian?
okay, well, if you're going to argue that the OMP is clear, it isn't. Do you agree?
I think it's clear in that it says, I think there's 14 existing bays. Car parking on site will be limited to, or the number of cars on site will be limited to 14 bays. I think the OMP provides a link or a connection to, or an example of where additional car parking could be provided if a tenant needed it. And I accept that an OMP requiring additional works is not a mechanism to do that. It would need to be through an amended DA to construct, like to have approval for those additional bays to be constructed. And through that amended DA process, the OMP would be amended to say, well, there's 14 here now, there's going to be 24 constructed, 24 bays or 24 cars are allowed on site, essentially.
Okay, let's see if any other members have questions. Councillor Jones, I think. Did you have a question? Yes.
Yes, please. My question's for Ted. What's the maximum number of tenants provision you envisage for the site?
So I wasn't sure I can answer. Yeah, there's 30 bedrooms on site. We said, again, just from a transparency point of view, that we did a BCA, so a building maximum occupancy per the building, and I think it was sort of 79 people that you could possibly get in there from a BCA perspective. But there's 32 bedrooms on site. or actually just under that as well at the moment. Yeah. So we just,
Thank you.
provided both those figures just to the community so they could see.
Councillor Pizzey.
Just a quick question further on the parking. So you keep mentioning if the tenant required more parking, do you mean in the sense if you picked a tenant and the city's decided actually the parking is not adequate for that tenant, but the tenant believes that it is, would you then listen to the city and put more parking in, as the area is a very busy area, especially at school pickup times?
Yeah, agreed. Yes, in short.
I mean, in short, or if the city said that needs more parking, would you put more parking in?
Yes, and that was the intention, councillor, of being as transparent as we could in identifying areas where that could be done. Whilst I'm confident that the tenants that we've spoken to through a combination of shared infrastructure, the bicycle infrastructure we're putting in place, the pedestrian network will accommodate the potential tenants that we've identified as suitable for the site. Again, from a transparency point of view, if we did need to provide additional bays, we've clearly delineated 2 separate areas in which we could then convert to parking if required by the City of Joondalup.
Ms. German.
Yeah, I guess I'm on parking as well. I'm still trying to think of the trigger or the mechanism of revising the car parking, and it may be a question later to the city, but as far as then you would need to, I assume, amend the traffic impact statement, which without that condition doesn't seem to be a trigger other than what's in the OMP. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on how that process would work, and then I'd probably ask the city on their thoughts as well.
Yeah, there's probably 2 scenarios. Obviously, one, the condition remains, condition 7, that requires the additional car parking bays, and then I guess there's no amendments to documentation required and we'd be required to construct the car parking. If the condition were to be deleted and a tenant came along and said we want those additional 10 bays to be provided, we would need to go through a Form 2 process to amend the existing approval, seek approval for those bays, which would include updating a traffic impact statement to reflect the additional parking.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions from panel members? No? Okay, thank you very much, gents. We'll move on to the city. Now, Catherine, are you planning to make any particular statements or just take questions?
Look, I'm happy to take questions. I think because parking's been discussed by everybody, I'll just jump in and talk through some of the information that we provided in response to the Reg 13 request for some additional information. And so certainly the proponent in their application had proposed to provide an additional 10 bays, and so 9 of those bays would be new bays, and the 10th bay is a result of what's an existing turnaround bay being altered into a car parking bay, because there's facilities with the new bays where people can turn around. And so it was always our intent through the approval that those additional bays would be constructed prior to commencement of the use. Certainly in receiving the Reg 13 request, we sort of went back and had a look at the conditions, and I guess can understand that they probably weren't clear enough. And so we did suggest some alternate wording for condition 4 and condition 7, and that's to specifically make it very clear that those additional parking bays are required to be constructed prior to commencement of the use. I'll leave my comments at that, but I'm really happy to take any questions that any panel members have.
Right, thank you. Questions from panel members? Councillor Jones.
Thank you. A question for Catherine. Look, we've got the leafy tree suburb programme in the City of Joondalup, and it just seems sacrilege that we could have trees and landscaping removed for car parking that might not be necessary. But at the same time, I'm also concerned about Dan Pearce not having much confidence in the operational management plan. And I just wondered if you could reinforce to Whitford's Catholic Primary School that the operational management plan can be effective.
Look, thank you for the question, and through you, presiding member. Look, we are quite comfortable that the operational management plan subject to those amended conditions that we suggested through the Reg 13 request, can actually, I guess, ensure that the site operates appropriately. We don't share the view that Mr. Pearce has, that the OMP is too uncertain. We feel as though the information that's in the OMP in the context of the tenant typologies and the waste collection and those sorts of matters demonstrate quite clearly how that would function. And I guess just to give some background to the OMP, obviously this site was the subject of a proposal over the last couple of years for the site to be used as a residential drug and alcohol rehabilitation facility. And there was a lot of concern in the community around that and the implications that that type of use might have on the school in particular and on the daycare centre that's on the other side of the site. And so a development application for approval under the MRS was submitted to the city. That was actually withdrawn when the site was sold. And so there was no outcome from that particular development proposal. We had a number of members of the community who had expressed an interest in wanting to remain informed as to any further developments with the site. And so part of the consultation process that we went through with this application actually included informing those people of the application. So we didn't just confine it to what we would normally do for a statutory planning application. We actually went that little bit further to let those people know about this proposal that had been submitted. But look, I guess in short, and sorry, I just thought it was worthwhile providing that little bit of history in that response, but really in short, in response to the question, we're of the view that the operational management plan and just with those tweaks to those conditions that we've suggested does provide some certainty that that additional parking can be provided. In relation to your comment around the trees and the landscaping, yes, it's always a shame when those sorts of things are removed to make way for parking. I think there was an aerial photograph that the proponent showed in their presentation earlier. There's a lot of landscaping on that site, and so even if those areas were removed for car parking, the site would still exceed the landscaping requirements that exist under the scheme for this sort of a use.
Thank you.
Further questions? Councillor Pizzey.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions for Catherine at the city around the operational management plan. If future tenants are not deemed appropriate by the city or the community has concern and expresses that, would the city be able to refuse future tenants?
Look, the use that's being considered here is for a residential building. And so whilst the operational management plan at this stage does list, I think there's 4 tenant typologies in it, and I'm just trying to find where I've got it in front of me, that won't be included. If any tenants that didn't fit those particular 4 that they've listed in the operational management plan came in and the use of the site still satisfied the definition of a residential building, then there would be no ability to be able to deny those tenants to be able to reside there.
And just a question on that. So you kind of answered it. So if a problem or issue falls outside of the operation management plan that we haven't thought about, that isn't written into it, is there a way the city can restrict that tenant?
Look, I guess it comes down to what the issue is and whether that issue is related inherently to the planning approval or whether there's other issues that eventuate, as they do it at any site across the city. And so the city will always endeavour to try and resolve issues that occur, whether that is a result of a planning approval, a building approval, or just simply an issue that's arisen as a result of a particular activity that's occurring on land.
Further questions? Yes, Ms German.
I was just interested in the city's thoughts on how they would manage amendments, just to picking up on the discussions about certainty and finality about conditions. If there was some major amendments to the OMP proposed as a result of a certain tenant, how would you see that playing out?
Thank you for the question. Look, it would be our expectation that in the event that there was to be any amendments to the operational management plan, that would not result in the use that was approved and the operation that was approved being vastly different from what was expected. And so if the tenant was to want to try and change things that meant that it perhaps didn't fit the definition of a residential building, or that we considered change the type of use or activity on the land, then that sort of thing, it would be my expectation, would have to go through a further development approval process to amend the approval.
Further questions?
Sorry, just a follow-on question on that. Picking up on the parking discussions, and you did touch on it before about like a traffic impact statement, and say that a tenant came in and said that they needed, for example, 20 more parking bays, which is showing that, you know, that's that the modelling that's been done through the traffic impact statement, that type of thing, is needs amendments and things. Would that be done under the OMP, or would you see that as a Form 2, or how do you see that sort of working?
Look, I would probably expect that would come through as a Form 2, because the traffic impact statement that's been prepared, whilst it acknowledged that there could be a potential occupancy of, I think it's set up to 80 people, it did base the traffic movements on the measures that they have proposed in the operational management plan to limit the demand for parking on the site.
Okay. Further questions? Mr Curtis.
Just coming back to the operational management plan, we're all talking about the need for that to be clear. I'm unclear as to what exactly the operational management plan is to include. And the reason being is that there's been a number of descriptors in the development application report and elsewhere in the TIS as well, loosely describing the kind of activities that might be on the site. The contents of the draft operational management plan have objectives, tenant typologies, resident occupancy and visitation, intended use of buildings, waste management. The applicants have come up with a different list in their submissions, which have referred to including operating hours, staff numbers, traffic and car parking, maximum occupancy and visitation, use of buildings, noise, incidents and complaints. To me, it is very unclear what exactly is the requirement on the applicants to include in the operational management plan. Can you clarify that, please?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the question. And so the city's intent through the conditions of approval and the operational management plan that was attached to the report is that the operational management plan is updated to provide absolute clarity that those additional parking bays would be provided. Now, the applicant did, in their planning report that accompanied their proposal, set out a number of areas that they could update the operational management plan with, subject to a tenant being appointed. And I guess it's our view that the nature of the use being a residential building and the current provisions that exist in that draft operational management plan, we don't necessarily need to to know the nature and the type of tenant in the operational management plan, providing it doesn't meet any of those that are excluded within that draft, and that it still meets the definition of a residential building as it's defined. And then issues such as traffic and car parking, I think we've covered that. The occupancy requirements will actually exist, be governed through the occupancy permit process, and so they won't be able to go over and above what they're permitted to have through that process. There will be a requirement, as exists for any other development, that they will need to comply with the noise regulations. And so in the event, let's to say down the track, there was some concerns around noise, that's something that could be investigated by the city at that point in time. And then if measures needed to be taken, that could happen separate to the occupancy permit process. And so in terms of what the OP, or how we see the OP, it would pretty much be as it's attached to the report, with some amendments to provide clarity that those additional parking bays will be provided prior to commencement of the use.
Yes.
Just follow up. What I'm hearing you say, and I've heard others say, is that the operational management plan could, subject to negotiations, could cover all sorts of things, and it could be changed through those discussions without obviously any reference back to a body like this, unless there's a Form 2. So where I'm going back to is it clear and concise, and is it final right now? Because I'm hearing you say there's lots of things that could be covered, but they would normally be covered by conditions, a lot of these. And there aren't the conditions. So are you sure that you can say that as of now, that the way it's worded, it's clear and concise and it's final?
Yes, thank you for the question. As I mentioned earlier, in response to a question, or perhaps when I gave a brief address at the beginning, we did provide some alternate wordings to condition 4 and 7 in the Reg 13 request. And that is actually providing some greater clarity around how the OMP needs to be updated with respect to the parking. So yes, we are of the view that it's very clear about what the OMP will look like. And at the end of the day, if the applicant is wanting to make any changes to the operation, they would approach the city, and at that point in time, it would be, is a development approval required? If they're wanting to change anything that's set in the operations management plan, that would most likely require a Form 2 application.
Okay, thank you for that. Any further questions? Yes, Ms. Jones.
Do you feel that the operational management plan has sufficient weight to manage those land uses, those ones excluded, that's identified, those 4, like for example the alcohol and the backpackers? And do you feel that the operational management plan is that right avenue of doing that, and whether it would have sufficient weight?
Yeah, look, thanks for the question. Yes, I do. The planning condition that's been recommended is quite clear that the development needs to be undertaken in accordance with the OMP. The OMP states that there's tenants that will be prohibited from occupying the site, and so we're quite comfortable that that would manage any concern around that.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions?
Sorry, I've
Yes,
got another one. The operational management plan does not propose an additional 10, 9, whatever the number of car parking spaces are. So it's in contradiction to what you're requiring of them. Can you clarify that?
Yes, and so in the Reg 13 request, we've suggested an updated condition, it's suggested to amend condition 4 to clarify that the OMP provided as attachment 4 shall be revised to reflect that the 9 additional parking bays shown on the approved plans will be constructed prior to occupation of the development. So that provides that certainty.
Further questions? No. Okay. Thank you, Catherine, for that. We'll move on to the item. We have a recommendation for approval with conditions. I'm looking for a mover and seconder of the published recommendation. Is there a mover? No? Okay, thank you. Oh yes, Councillor Jones, you're moving that? And is there a seconder? No, okay then, thank you. That lapses for want of a seconder. Looking for an alternative motion. Is there an alternative motion? I need something. Yes, Mr. Curtis.
The concern I've raised here, and I guess it is along the lines.
We need a motion.
Okay, sorry.
Without this discussion.
Okay, the motion is that this application be deferred as it's currently premature and further information is required to appropriately assess the proposal.
Can I make a couple of suggestions there, just that the application be deferred for a period of up to 90 days to enable the applicant to more clearly define how the proposed development will be used and the consequent number of staff, their visitation frequency, and the number and location of parking bays to be provided. Is that pretty much what
I'm saying, yeah.
You're saying? Okay. And could I add that the city to review the revised information from the applicant and reconsider proposed condition 4 to ensure that there is certainty and finality? I'm seeking a seconder for that deferral. Thank you, Councillor Pizzi. There's no discussion because it's a procedural motion. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. So I'm going to put that motion. All in favour? Against? That's carried 4-1. Thank you. Thank you for that. We'll move on in the meeting. There are 2 matters. Very general business. No, thank you. And I'll close the meeting at 10:25.